The crowd screamed like a living thing, like some massive beast made of a million voices all crying out for blood, and the arena of Kavorath shook under the weight of their hunger as the champion stepped into the light. Gorathal stood 9 feet tall with scales the color of a dying sun and claws that burned with plasma fire. And when he raised his arms, the crowd roared so loud it felt like the station itself might crack apart at the seams. His opponent was already dead on the sand, split open from throat to belly, and the blood that pooled around the body was not red but a deep violet that steamed in the arena heat. Gorath did not even look at the corpse. He simply turned and walked back through the champion's gate while 40 billion viewers across the galaxy watched and cheered, and placed their bets for the next fight, because this was the crucible of Kavorath, and here death was entertainment and entertainment was everything. The crucible was no ordinary arena. It was a station the size of a small moon that orbited a dead star in the far reaches of the outer veil, and it had stood for over 600 galactic cycles as the greatest gladiatorial stage the universe had ever known. Fighters came from every corner of every empire. Some were prisoners, some were desperate, some were warriors seeking glory, and all of them understood the same simple truth. You fought and you lived, or you fought and you died, and if you lived long enough you earned your freedom. Gorathal had lived longer than anyone, and in 4 galactic cycles as champion he had killed 209 opponents, and not one of them had ever made him bleed. He was a god on the sand. And then one day, a cargo freighter drifted into contested space. It was a human ship, small and battered and running on half power with its shields barely holding, and its crew of 12 huddled in the cockpit praying to whatever gods humans prayed to that someone friendly would find them first. Someone unfriendly found them instead. The Korath raiders hit the freighter like wolves on a wounded deer, and within an hour the crew was in chains and the ship was scrap, and the humans were on their way to the crucible, because that was what happened to people who wandered into the wrong part of space without enough guns. Among the captured crew was a man named Eli Maddox. He was 34 years old and he had been a sergeant in the Human Coalition Marines before the war had ended and left him with nothing but scars and a limp from a piece of shrapnel that had buried itself in his left thigh on a world whose name he tried very hard not to remember. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall and lean in the way that men get when they have spent too long eating too little, and there was nothing about him that would make anyone look twice. No claws, no scales, no venom glands, no natural armor, no bioluminescence, no psychic ability, no secondary heart, nothing. Just skin and bone and muscle, and a pair of dark eyes that looked at the world like they had already seen the worst it had to offer, and were simply waiting to see if it had anything left. The slavers brought the captured humans to the auction block on Deck 9 of the Crucible, and one by one they were sold to the arena stables that trained and managed gladiators the way some cultures managed livestock. The bigger humans went first. A tall woman with broad shoulders fetched a decent price, and a thick-armed mechanic drew a few bids from mid-tier stables. But when Eli was pushed onto the block, the room went quiet. Not the dramatic kind of quiet, not the awed hush of anticipation, but the bored kind of quiet that meant nobody cared enough to even whisper. The auctioneer rattled off his stats in a flat voice. Human male, 34 cycles, no augmentations, no notable biology, minor leg damage, projected survival rating of 1 fight, maybe 2 if the matchmakers were feeling generous. A Bryn stable master laughed so hard his tusks rattled. A Sethari broker flicked her tongue in what passed for contempt among her people. Nobody bid. And then a 4-armed Kalari woman in the back row raised one of her left hands. Her name was Visha Wren, and she ran a small stable on the lower decks of the Crucible, a stable known for buying cheap fighters and occasionally, very occasionally, turning them into something worth watching. She paid less for Eli than most stables paid for a week of rations. When her other fighters saw the human for the first time, they did not try to hide their disgust. Kale, the Bryn grappler who stood 7 feet tall and weighed as much as a ground car, looked at Eli and snorted through his wide, flat nose, and said a word in his own language that roughly translated to already dead. Sithis, the Sethari blade dancer with venom dripping from her wrist spines, circled Eli once and then turned away without a word, because to her, he was not even worth the effort of an insult. They called him soft skin, and they laughed when he sat in the corner of the common room and ate his rations without speaking, and they laughed harder when he asked Visha for his equipment. "A blade," he said, and his voice was calm and flat like still water over deep ground. "Something short and curved if you have it, and something to wrap my hands with. Not armor, not a shield, not a gun, a blade and hand wraps." Visha gave him what he asked for because it cost her almost nothing, and she had learned a long time ago that cheap investments sometimes paid the biggest returns. That night, while the other fighters slept, Eli sat in his cell with the cracked screen that Visha had given him, and he watched arena footage. Hour after hour after hour he watched old fights, new fights, champion bouts, qualifier rounds, free-for-all pits. And as he watched, he did something that none of the cameras caught but that Visha noticed on her monitor when she checked on him before dawn. He was counting. His lips moved and numbers came out in a whisper so quiet that even the microphone in his cell barely picked it up. And the numbers were not random. They were distances and reaction times and step counts and angles, and the spaces between attacks where a body could slip through if it was in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. He counted the way a machine counts, steady and relentless and without emotion. And when dawn came and the other fighters woke to train, he was still sitting there with the screen glowing against his face and the numbers still falling from his lips. Visha watched him from her office, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something cold that crawled up the back of her neck and settled behind her eyes. She did not know what it was. Later she would understand that it was the feeling every predator in the galaxy feels when it realizes it is no longer the most dangerous thing in the room. The next morning, the arena registry posted the bracket for the opening qualifier round, a free-for-all pit fight with 20 combatants thrown onto the sand at once where the rules were simple. Fight until the horn sounds, and whoever is still standing gets to fight again. The survival rate for qualifiers was 15%. The odds makers listed every fighter's chances on the big screens that hung above the main concourse, and the numbers flickered and shifted as bets poured in from across the galaxy. Eli's name was at the bottom of the list. His odds were so low that most betting houses did not even bother to display them, because the math said he would be dead within the first 2 minutes. Somewhere in the champion's quarters high above the arena floor, Gorath Thal was eating raw meat from a silver tray, and he did not know the human's name, and he did not care. Somewhere on Deck 9, Eli Maddox was wrapping his hands in slow, careful loops and testing the weight of a short, curved blade, and the only sound in his cell was the quiet rhythm of his breathing. And somewhere in the back of Visha, Ren's mind, a single thought kept turning over and over like a stone in a river. She had bought hundreds of fighters in her career, and she had watched most of them die, but she had never, not once in all her years, seen anyone count the way the human counted. Like he already knew exactly how many bodies it would take. Like he had already done the math. The qualifier pit was a circle of blood-stained sand 200 meters across with walls too high to climb and no exits, except the gates that would only open when the horn told them to. And 20 fighters stood inside it waiting for the signal to kill each other. The crowd above was restless and loud and drunk on cheap stimulants and alien liquor, because the qualifier round was never the main event. It was the appetizer, the warm-up. The thing you watched with half an eye, while you argued about who would win the real fights later. Nobody paid attention to the small human standing near the eastern wall. Eli Maddox was barefoot on the sand with his hands wrapped tight and the short curved blade hanging loose at his side, and he was breathing in a slow, steady rhythm that made his chest rise and fall like the tide of some quiet ocean that nobody else could see. Around him, the other 19 fighters were growling and snarling and pounding their chests and flashing their claws and doing all the things that predators do when they want the world to know they are dangerous. Eli did none of these things. He just stood there and breathed and watched. The horn sounded. It was a deep shaking blast that rattled the sand and the walls and the bones of every living thing in the pit. And then 20 fighters surged forward, and the killing began. 2 massive Grellock warriors spotted Eli immediately. A pair of gray-skinned brutes with arms like tree trunks and jaws that could crush metal, and they came at him from both sides because they saw what everyone saw. A small, soft creature with no armor and no chance. The first Grellock charged with its head down, and its fists raised, and it was fast. Much faster than something that big had any right to be. And if Eli had tried to block the charge or meet it with force, he would have been crushed like an insect under a boot. But Eli did not block. He stepped sideways, not a big dramatic leap but a single precise step to his left, exactly the distance he needed, and not 1 inch more. And the Grellock's fist cut through the air where his head had been, and its own momentum carried it stumbling forward past him. Eli turned as the creature passed and drew the curved blade across its throat in a single clean motion that opened the flesh from one side to the other, and the Grellock crashed face first into the sand with its blood pouring out in a thick gray river. The second Grellock roared and swung wide with both fists in a sweeping arc that would have shattered every bone in Eli's body, but Eli dropped low. So low his knees touched the sand, and the swing passed over him like a storm passing over a stone, and before the Grellock could pull its arms back, Eli drove the blade into the soft space behind its knee where the tendons connected. The creature fell screaming, and Eli was on top of it before it hit the ground, and the blade found the base of its skull, and the screaming stopped. 11 seconds. That was how long it took from the moment the first Grellock charged to the moment the second one stopped moving, and somewhere in the broadcast, Booth, a Kalari commentator, blinked all 4 of her eyes and said, "Wait," and rewound the footage because she thought she must have missed something. She had not missed anything. Eli was already moving again, not charging into the chaos of the pit, but drifting along its edges like smoke, like a shadow with a blade. And he positioned himself in the spaces between the bigger fights where the dying crawled and the desperate scrambled. He did not seek out enemies. He let them come to him. A Torvan with cybernetic arms lunged at him from behind a pile of bodies, and Eli sidestepped again and cut the hydraulic lines in the alien's wrist. And when the Torvan's hand went dead, and useless Eli opened his belly with a single upward stroke. A pair of Vexi twins tried to flank him, and Eli backed into a narrow gap between 2 fallen fighters, where only one attacker could reach him at a time, and he killed them one after the other, with the calm patience of a man threading a needle. And the whole time, his lips were moving. Numbers came out of him in a whisper that the arena microphones barely caught, and the numbers were not random, they were the mathematics of murder. Distance to the nearest threat, steps to the next piece of cover, seconds until the Bryn fighter on his left would finish his current kill and turn looking for a new one, angle of attack needed to slip between the Sethari's venom strikes. He was not fighting the way gladiators fought. He was solving the pit like it was an equation, and every variable had a value, and every value had a solution. A Sethari warrior cornered him against the eastern wall and reared back and spat a stream of venom that could eat through metal in seconds, and the crowd surged forward in their seats, because surely this was where the humans' luck ran out. Eli grabbed a fistful of sand and threw it, not at the Sethari's eyes but at the ground in front of its feet, and the creature flinched, just a tiny flinch, just a fraction of a second of hesitation as its instincts told it something was coming at its face. That fraction of a second was all Eli needed. He closed the distance in 2 strides and drove the blade upward through the gap in the Sethari's neck plates where the scales were thinnest and the flesh was soft, and the alien made a sound like air leaving a punctured balloon and collapsed. The crowd went quiet. Not the bored quiet of the beginning, but a different kind of quiet. The kind that falls over a room when everyone in it realizes at the same time that they are watching something they have never seen before and may never see again. The pit fight lasted 12 minutes in total, and when the horn sounded again, there were 3 fighters left standing on the sand. One was a Bryn grappler who had survived by being too big and too tough for anyone to bring down quickly. One was a cybernetically enhanced Koreth assassin who had spent the entire fight hiding behind a pile of corpses and picking off wounded stragglers. And one was Eli Maddox. He stood in the center of the pit with alien blood of 5 different colors running down his arms and chest and face, and his bad leg was shaking beneath him, and there was a long shallow cut across his ribs that he did not seem to notice, and the curved blade in his hand was so slick with blood that it dripped a steady rhythm onto the sand. He did not raise his arms in victory. He did not roar or beat his chest or acknowledge the crowd in any way. He just turned and walked toward the gate, and his bare feet left red prints on the sand behind him. That night in his cell on Vish's lower deck, Eli sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his blade on the ground beside him, and he did something that Visha saw on her monitor but did not understand. He picked up a small, sharp piece of metal from the floor, a fragment of something broken that he must have found somewhere, and he began to scratch marks into the wall. Not words, not symbols, just simple vertical lines, tally marks, one after another after another. Visha counted them as he made them. 7 marks. 7 bodies on the sand. She pressed the intercom button, and her voice came through the speaker in his cell, thin and crackling with static. "What are you doing, human?" Eli did not look up, and he did not stop scratching. "Keeping count," he said, and his voice was the same flat, calm water it had always been. "I owe a debt, and when I have paid it I am leaving." Visha stared at the monitor for a long time after that. In the gambling dens deep below the arena floor, where the serious money moved in rivers of data, and light the odds on the human shifted. Not by much, not enough that anyone important would notice, but enough that a few sharp-eyed gamblers raised their heads and paid attention. On the arena feeds, the qualifier results scrolled past in small text at the bottom of the screen, and the human's name was there among the survivors, a footnote in a story that nobody thought was going anywhere. In the champion's quarters high above, Gorath Thal slept with his claws retracted and his scales dim, and he dreamed of nothing at all because champions do not dream of things that are beneath them. And in a small cell on the lower decks of the Crucible, a human with blood under his fingernails sat in the dark and stared at the tally marks on his wall, and the marks stared back at him like tiny open graves waiting to be filled. 7 down. A long way still to go. They kept sending bigger things to kill him, and he kept not dying. That was the part the galaxy could not understand, not the winning, because upsets happened all the time in the Crucible, and sometimes the small thing beat the big thing and the crowd cheered and forgot about it by morning. But the not dying, the way the human absorbed punishment that should have ended him and simply kept moving forward like pain, was a language he had chosen not to speak. The arena masters pushed Eli through the mid-tier rounds, with the casual cruelty of people who expected the entertainment to end soon. And they matched him against fighters who were designed by evolution or engineering or both to be perfect killing machines. First came a Torvon duelist named Reth who carried 4 blades and could swing them all at once in patterns so complex that most opponents could not even see the strikes coming before they were already cut open. and Reth was fast, blindingly fast. And in the first minute of the fight, he opened 3 wounds on Eli's body, and the crowd smelled the end. But Eli did not fall. He backed away and he bled and he watched, and what he was watching was not the blades but the feet, because a fighter's feet always told the truth even when the hands were lying. And by the second minute, Eli had seen the pattern, a tiny shift of weight to the left before every third combination. And on the next combination, he was not where the blades expected him to be, and his own blade found the gap between Reth's armor plates, and the Torvon died, with a look of pure confusion on his face. Then came a Bryn grappler twice Eli's mass, who fought by grabbing opponents and crushing them against the ground until their bones turned to powder. And this one was smart enough not to charge blindly and patient enough to circle and wait for his moment. So Eli gave him his moment. He pretended to stumble on his bad leg, a tiny thing, just a half-second of imbalance. And the Bryn lunged and grabbed him, and the crowd groaned because everyone knew what came next when a Bryn got its hands on you. But Eli had been grabbed before by things that wanted to kill him, and he knew that the first 3 seconds were the only seconds that mattered. And in those 3 seconds, he drove his thumbs into the nerve clusters on either side of the Bryn's thick neck, a spot he had found by watching 14 hours of Bryn fight footage on his cracked screen, and the alien's grip went slack for just 1 heartbeat. 1 heartbeat was enough. Eli twisted free and opened the Bryn's throat before the creature's hands remembered how to close. And then came the fight that changed everything. The arena masters sent a Cathari Sion against him, a tall, thin creature with skin like gray paper and eyes like black pools that could read the surface thoughts of any living mind within 20 meters. And Sions were considered the ultimate counter to skilled fighters, because it did not matter how fast or clever you were when your enemy knew what you were going to do before you did it. The Cathari entered the arena with the lazy confidence of a predator that had never needed to hurry, and it reached out with its mind and touched Eli's thoughts the way a hand might touch the surface of a pond, expecting to feel the ripples of strategy and fear and intention that every fighter carried. It felt nothing. Not emptiness, nothing, like reaching into a dark room and finding that the floor was not where you expected it to be. And the Cathari's black eyes went wide for the first time in its career, because the human's mind was not thinking at all. Eli had stopped thinking. Somewhere in the deep machinery of his brain, the years of combat training had taken over muscle memory so deeply carved into his nervous system that his body moved without conscious thought, without intention, without the surface ripples that a Sion could read. And he became something that the galaxy had no word for. A predator that hunted on pure instinct wrapped in the precision of 10,000 hours of practice. The Cathari tried to adjust, tried to reach deeper, tried to find something, anything, to grab onto. And while it was trying, Eli closed the distance between them in 3 steps and killed it with a single strike that the Sion never saw coming because there had been no thought to see. The crowd erupted, and the sound was different now. Not the hungry roar of spectators watching meat get torn apart, but something closer to awe, something closer to fear, something that said, "We do not understand what we are watching, but we cannot look away." Eli's fights went viral across the galactic networks. Clips of his kills spread through every corner of every empire and species and colony, and within days the human had more viewers than fighters who had been in the crucible for years, and the commentators could not stop talking about him. They brought in xenobiologists who explained to stunned audiences that humans were persistent predators from a death world called Earth, a planet so hostile that its dominant species had evolved not to be the fastest or the strongest or the most venomous, but to be the thing that never stopped chasing you, the thing that could run for days without rest, the thing that healed from wounds that would kill other species, the thing that adapted to any environment and any enemy and any situation because adaptation was written into the very core of what they were. A phrase began circulating on the forums and in the bars and in the gambling dens. and it spread so fast that within a week half the galaxy was repeating it. The human does not win, he just refuses to die until you do. In the champion's quarters, Gorath Thal watched the footage of Eli's fights for the first time, and he did not laugh the way his handlers expected him to. He watched in silence, and when the footage ended, he watched it again, and his plasma claws flickered in and out like a heartbeat, and his handlers exchanged nervous glances because they had never seen the champion study an opponent before. He had never needed to. On the lower decks, Visha Wren sat in her office surrounded by screens showing viewer numbers and betting odds and sponsorship offers that were pouring in faster than she could read them. And she should have been happy because her cheap investment was making her rich. But instead, she felt that cold thing on the back of her neck again, that feeling of being close to something dangerous. She went to Eli's cell one night after his 5th mid-tier victory, and she found him sitting on the floor as always with the blade beside him and the cracked screen dark, and the wall behind him covered in tally marks, dozens of them now, scratched into the metal in neat rows. "How many do you need?" she asked. Eli looked at the wall and then he looked at her, and for the first time since she had bought him, she saw something in his eyes that was not calm and was not flat. Something deep and broken that moved beneath the surface like a creature swimming under dark water. 1,447, he said. Visha felt the cold thing on her neck turn into ice. "That is not an arena number," she said quietly. "What does it mean?" Eli turned back to the wall, and he was quiet for a long time. "There was a colony called New Meridian," he said. And his voice was still flat, but now it was the flatness of a man holding something down, pressing it into the ground with both hands so it would not rise up and swallow him whole. Human settlement on the edge of Korath space. Farming world, families, children. A school with a yellow roof and a bell that rang every morning at dawn. He paused. Raiders came, Korath and Drakvari and others. A mixed fleet looking for sport, and they burned it all. Every building, every field, every street, and they killed every single person in that colony, while the rest of the galaxy watched the feeds and did nothing. His hand found the wall and his fingers touched the tally marks the way. A blind man touches a face he is trying to remember. 1,447 people, he said. "I know because I counted them after, every body, every name, and I was the only one left standing in the ash." Visha understood then. He was not fighting for freedom. He was not fighting for glory or money or survival. He was fighting a war of grief, one body at a time, and every kill on the sand was a name crossed off a list that no one else in the galaxy even knew existed. She left his cell without another word, and she went back to her office, and she sat in the dark for a long time. And on the screens around her the galaxy buzzed and hummed with excitement about the human gladiator who would not die, and none of them knew, not one single soul among the billions watching, that every fight they cheered was a funeral. The elite tier of the Crucible was where legends were made, and where most fighters came to die in front of the largest audiences the galaxy could assemble, and Eli Maddox had no business being there. That was the opinion of every expert and every commentator and every retired champion who had ever held a blade on the sand. And they said it on every feed and every broadcast with the absolute confidence of people who understood the numbers. And the numbers said that a human, a small, soft, breakable human with no biological advantages and a bad leg and a short, curved blade, could not survive what was coming. The elite tier was not the mid-rounds where raw talent and clever tricks could carry you through, against opponents who were good but not great. This was where the monsters lived. Eli's first elite fight was against the Drakvari twins, Kor and Thane, 2 brothers who had fought as a pair for 9 cycles, and had never lost because they moved like one creature split into 2 bodies. Their attacks flowing together in combinations so seamless that fighting them was like fighting a river. They were each 7 feet tall with scales the color of burnt iron and teeth that could tear through ship hull plating. And when they walked onto the sand, the crowd chanted their names, and the sound was like thunder. Eli walked out after them, and the crowd went quiet. Not silent, but quiet the way a room full of people gets when they are holding their breath. The twins attacked together as they always did, one high and one low. And Eli was immediately in trouble because you cannot sidestep 2 threats from different angles, and you cannot back away from something that is faster than you. And within 30 seconds, he was bleeding from a deep slash across his ribs that showed white bone beneath the red. The crowd winced. The twins pressed harder, smelling the kill, and Kor caught Eli with a backhand strike that sent him sprawling across the sand. And Thane was already moving in for the finish. And then Eli did something that made no sense. He got up and instead of retreating, he stepped forward into the gap between the twins, and he let Kor's claws rake across his left side, a deliberate sacrifice that opened his flesh from hip to shoulder and painted the sand beneath him red. The crowd gasped because it looked like suicide. But Eli's blood was not just blood, it was physics. And as it poured onto the sand, it made the surface slick and wet in exactly the spot where Thane was planting his foot for the killing lunge. Thane's foot slipped. It was a small slip, just a fraction of a second of lost balance. But Eli had been counting, always counting, and he knew the fraction would come, and he was already moving when it happened, and his blade went through Thane's throat so fast that Kor did not even see his brother die. He only heard the body hit the sand. What happened next was something the galaxy would talk about for years. Kor, the surviving twin, let out a sound that was not a roar but a scream, a broken animal sound of grief and rage that echoed off the arena walls, and he abandoned all technique and all discipline and threw himself at Eli with nothing but fury. Fury is not strategy. Eli killed him in 43 seconds. He stood over the bodies of the twins, and the blood running down his side was mixing with theirs on the sand, and he did not celebrate, and the crowd did not know whether to cheer or weep. His next fight was worse. Commander Zelith had once led the 3rd Korath fleet before a political betrayal had landed her in the Crucible, and she wore powered exo-armor that multiplied her strength by a factor of 12 and made her skin harder than the walls of the arena itself. And she carried a hammer that could crack stone with a single swing. Eli could not cut through the armor. He tried in the first minute, and his blade skidded off the plating like a whisper off a mountain. And Zelith answered with a hammer blow that caught his left arm, and the sound it made was the sound of something breaking that was not meant to break. Eli went down and the crowd surged to its feet. He got up. Zelith hit him again, this time across the back, and he went down again and the sand turned red beneath him. He got up. She hit him again and again and again, driving him across the arena like a nail being hammered into wood. And each time he fell, the crowd expected him to stay down, and each time he rose again with his broken arm hanging useless at his side, and his blood leaving a trail behind him like a map of his suffering. 12 minutes this went on. 12 minutes of a human being beaten by a thing that should have killed him with the first blow, and by the 8th minute the crowd had stopped cheering for Zelith and started chanting something else. A word, a single word, repeated over and over in a rhythm that shook the arena. His name. They were chanting his name. And through all of it, through the pain and the blood and the breaking, Eli was counting. He was watching the armor, watching the way the cooling vents on Zelith's back opened and closed in a rhythmic cycle to keep the power systems from overheating, and he was counting the seconds between each cycle. 4 seconds open, 6 seconds closed, 4 seconds open, 6 seconds closed. On the 13th minute, Zelith swung the hammer in a wide arc that was meant to take his head off, and Eli ducked under it. Not cleanly. The edge of the hammer tore a strip of skin from his scalp, and he came up behind her. And in the 4-second window when the cooling vent was open, he jammed his blade into it with every ounce of strength his one working arm could give. The armor locked. The cooling system failed, and the power systems overheated, and every joint in the exo-armor seized at once. And Zelith stood frozen on the sand like a statue of herself, while inside the shell the temperature climbed and climbed, and she beat her fists against the inside of the plating and screamed. The screaming stopped after 40 seconds. The crowd was silent for 3 full heartbeats, and then it exploded, not with the usual bloodlust but with something raw and electric that ran through the station like a current. And for the first time in the history of the Crucible, the audience was not cheering for a kill. They were cheering for the thing that refused to be killed. Eli became more than a gladiator after that. He became a question that the entire galaxy was trying to answer. What are humans? The networks ran specials about Earth, about a world where the air was corrosive and the water was poison to half the species in the galaxy, and the ground shook, and the sky caught fire, and the dominant life form had somehow looked at all of this and said, "Yes, this is fine, we will build cities here." They ran footage of human history, and the aliens watched with wide eyes and open mouths as they saw a species that had fought itself for 10,000 years, and crossed oceans on wooden planks, and split the atom, and walked on its own moon, and domesticated apex predators for companionship, and survived ice ages and plagues and famines and wars that killed millions, and never once, not once in all of recorded history, simply laid down and accepted extinction. A commentator on the most-watched network in the galaxy, a Kalari journalist named Saren Voss, who had covered the Crucible for 30 years, looked into the camera and said the words that would be quoted in every corner of every empire for generations to come. "We thought they were weak because they were soft. We did not understand. Humans are not apex predators because of what they are. They are apex predators because of what they refuse to stop being. You do not beat a human by being stronger. You beat a human by making it quit. And in 10,000 years of recorded human history, they have never once quit." That night Visha came to Eli with a data chip in her hand. "Freedom Papers," she said. "I have the credits now, more than enough. You have earned it 10 times over, and I have already forged the documents. You can walk out of this station tonight and never look back." Eli was sitting on the floor of his cell with his broken arm in a crude splint, and his body wrapped in bandages that were already turning red, and he looked at the data chip in her hand, and then he looked at the wall behind him. The tally marks covered every inch of available space, hundreds of them, row after row after row, and in the dim light of the cell, they looked like the bars of a cage that he had built around himself. "How many?" Visha asked, though she already knew the answer. Eli's eyes moved across the marks, and his lips moved silently as he counted. 1,443. He said. He looked at her, and his dark eyes were steady and empty, and full all at the same time. 4 more. Visha closed her hand around the data chip, and she wanted to argue, and she wanted to scream, and she wanted to tell him that the dead do not keep count, and that no number of bodies on the sand would bring back a colony that was already ash. But she looked at his face, and she saw something there that she had never seen before in any fighter, in any stable, in any arena in the galaxy. She saw a man who was already finished. Not broken, finished. The way a blade is finished when the smith puts down the hammer. The way a storm is finished when there is nothing left to destroy, complete and terrible, and aimed at something that nothing in the universe could turn him away from. She put the data chip in her pocket and walked out. The final bracket was posted the next morning on every screen in the Crucible, and on every feed across the galaxy. The championship match. Gorath Thal, the undefeated champion 4-cycle king of the sand, 312 kills, never wounded versus the human. 40 billion viewers registered to watch. And somewhere in a cell on the lower decks, a man with a broken arm and a wall full of tallies closed his eyes and whispered 4 names that no one else would ever hear. The championship arena was not like the pits below. It was a cathedral of violence built at the very top of the crucible where the dome opened to the naked stars, and the sand was white as bone, and the walls were lined with screens 100 meters tall that showed the faces of the fighters so large that you could count the scars on their skin. The terrain shifted. Great slabs of rock rose from the floor and pools of dark water filled the gaps between them, and jets of fire erupted from vents in the ground on timers that only the arena masters knew. And the whole thing was designed not for fairness, but for spectacle, because this was the greatest show the galaxy had ever produced, and 40 billion souls across every empire and every world and every station were watching. Gorathal entered first. He came through the champion's gate like a god descending from a throne 9 feet of scaled perfection, with plasma claws burning blue-white at the tips of his fingers, and eyes like molten copper that swept across the arena with the lazy confidence of a creature that had never known fear. The crowd worshipped him. His name rolled through the station like a wave, Gorath, 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 and he raised his claws and the plasma flared, and the light from them cast shadows across the sand that looked like the hands of something reaching up from below. 312 kills. 4 cycles undefeated. He had never bled on the sand. Then the far gate opened and the sound changed. It did not get louder, it got quieter. A slow falling hush that spread through the crowd like frost spreading across glass, and 40 billion viewers leaned forward in their seats or their pods or their ships or wherever they were because they knew what was coming and they wanted to see it with their own eyes. Eli Maddox walked onto the white sand barefoot. His hands were wrapped, the left arm still splinted beneath the cloth, and the short curved blade hung at his side, and there was no fanfare and no music and no display of power. Just a man walking forward 1 step at a time with the stars above him and the sand below him and nothing else. He was smaller than he looked on the feeds, a fact that made the crowd go even quieter because, standing across from Gorathal, he looked like something that could be broken by accident, a fragile assemblage of skin and bone and stubborn heartbeats that had no business being on this sand. But every single soul watching knew better now. They had learned. The horn sounded and Gorath moved first. He was faster than anything Eli had faced, so fast that the first strike came before Eli's body could fully react, and a plasma claw raked across Eli's chest and opened a burning line from his collarbone to his stomach that smoked and sizzled as the superheated edge cauterized the wound it was making. Eli staggered back and Gorath was already there, already swinging again, and the second blow caught him across the shoulder and spun him sideways, and the third was a downward strike that Eli barely rolled away from as the plasma claws carved a molten groove into the white sand where his head had been. The first 5 minutes were a massacre. Gorath was everything the galaxy believed him to be: faster, stronger, tougher, more lethal than any living thing in the known universe. And he drove Eli across the arena like a storm driving a leaf, and the blood that fell from the human's wounds painted the white sand in streaks of red that the cameras captured in terrible detail. The crowd watched in silence. Some of them could not bear to look. And then somewhere around the 6th minute something shifted, not in the fight itself, but in the way Eli moved through it, because he stopped trying to fight back and he started trying to survive. He used the terrain the way water uses a riverbed, flowing around the rock slabs and through the gaps and over the pools. And when the fire vents erupted, he moved through them, letting the flames lick across his skin and cauterize the wounds that were bleeding the fastest. Gorath chased him, and the champion's frustration grew with every second, because this was not how fights were supposed to go. Opponents were supposed to stand and face him and die with some dignity. Not run, not hide, not turn the sacred sand into a game of chase. "Stand and face me," Gorath roared, and his voice was thunder. Eli said nothing. He kept moving, kept bleeding, kept breathing in that slow, steady rhythm, and the minutes stretched and the champion's strikes began to lose their crispness. Just slightly, just a fraction, the way a blade loses its edge after too many cuts. Because Gorath had never needed to fight this long, and his biology was built for explosive power, not sustained effort. That was the thing about humans that no species in the galaxy had ever truly understood until now. They were not built to win fast. They were built to be the last thing standing when everything else had burned itself out. In the 10th minute, the arena microphones picked up something strange. Eli's lips were moving and sounds were coming out, but they were not numbers this time. They were names. Anna Calloway, he whispered as he ducked beneath a plasma strike. David Rahan, as he rolled behind a rock slab. Maria Santos, age 7, as he pressed his back against the stone and let the blood run down his legs. He was reciting the dead of New Meridian. Every name, every soul, every man and woman and child who had burned while the galaxy watched and did nothing. And with each name something changed in the way he held himself. The pain in his eyes faded, the trembling in his limbs steadied, and something old and deep and terrifyingly patient settled into his body like an ancient thing waking up from a long sleep. Gorath came around the rock slab with his claws raised, and Eli met him for the first time, not retreating, not dodging, but stepping forward into the strike. The plasma claw went through Eli's right shoulder, and the crowd screamed, and Gorath's copper eyes flared with triumph, because the killing blow was next, and it was already in motion. But Eli did not fall. He locked his arm around Gorath's wrist, and he held on with a grip that should not have been possible for a creature his size, a grip fueled by something beyond muscle and beyond adrenaline, something that the xenobiologists would later call hysterical strength, but that was really just the simple, terrible math of a man who had decided that dying was not one of the options available to him right now. He twisted, and the sound of Gorath's wrist joint breaking between the armor plates was so loud that the front rows of the crowd heard it over the roar. The champion screamed. It was the first time in 4 cycles that Gorath Thal had made a sound of pain, and the galaxy heard it, and 40 billion souls realized in that moment that gods could bleed. Eli tore one of the plasma claws from the champion's broken hand, and he held it in his own, and the blue-white fire reflected in his dark eyes like stars burning in a void. Gorath attacked with his remaining hand, wild now, desperate, the discipline of a champion shattered by the impossible reality of a human who would not die, and Eli took the hits, took the cuts, took the burning, and he kept moving forward because that was what humans did, that was what they had always done. That was the one truth that the galaxy had never understood, until a small, soft, breakable man on a white sand arena showed them. They moved forward. Always forward. The final exchange was not elegant. It was 2 broken, bleeding creatures on a blood-soaked floor swinging at each other with everything they had left, and it was ugly and raw and desperate, and the crowd was screaming so loud that the station's structural alarms triggered. Eli fainted left and Gorath lunged, and for one heartbeat, one single heartbeat, the champion's chest was open, the scales parted where the armor plates met, and the gap was barely wide enough for a blade. It was wide enough for a plasma claw. Eli drove it home. The blue-white fire punched through scale and muscle and bone, and Gorath Thal's copper eyes went wide, not with pain but with something like understanding, something like respect, and the champion of the crucible fell to his knees on the white sand that was no longer white, and then he fell forward and did not move again. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on every soul in its reach, that makes the universe itself seem to pause and hold its breath. Eli stood alone on the sand. He was barely standing, his left arm broken, his right shoulder destroyed, his body opened in a dozen places and held together by nothing but will and whatever dark fuel was burning in the furnace of his chest, and he swayed like a tree in a storm that had been blowing for a very long time. He looked up. The cameras were on him and 40 billion faces were watching, and the screens on the arena walls showed his face 100 meters tall. A small human face covered in blood and ash and the remnants of fire, with dark eyes that held something the galaxy had no word for. He opened his mouth, and his voice was a ragged whisper that the microphones carried across every speaker in the crucible and every broadcast feed across the stars. 1447. He dropped the plasma claw, and it hissed on the wet sand. He turned his back on the arena and on the crowd, and on the body of the greatest champion the galaxy had ever known, and he walked toward the gate, slowly, painfully, one bare bloody foot in front of the other, and he did not look back. Visha was waiting at the gate. She had the freedom papers in one hand and a medical kit in the other, and tears running down 2 of her 4 cheeks, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say. And he did not thank her because they both knew that thanks was not what this moment was made of. Eli Maddox left the crucible of Kavarath on a cargo shuttle 3 hours later. He did not take the prize money. He did not take the title. He did not take anything except a battered photograph that he kept in the inside pocket of a borrowed jacket. A photograph of a small town with a yellow-roofed school and wheat fields stretching to a horizon beneath a setting sun, and faces, dozens of faces, smiling in the golden light of a world that did not exist anymore. He sat alone in the cargo bay of the shuttle with the stars streaming past the viewport, and he unfolded the photograph and looked at it for a long time, and then he folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket and closed his eyes. Across the galaxy in 1,000 arena bars and betting halls and military academies and government chambers, beings of every species and every world watched the replay of what had happened, and they were quiet in a way they had never been quiet before. Gladiators who had once laughed at the idea of a human on the sand did not laugh anymore. Commanders who had once dismissed humanity as soft and weak and unimportant did not dismiss them anymore. And in a small bar on the outer ring of a trading station deep in the Koreth territories, a young alien soldier watched the broadcast with wide eyes and turned to his commander and asked the question that the entire galaxy was asking. What makes humans so dangerous? The commander was old and scarred, and he had fought humans once in a border war that his government preferred to forget. And he stared at the screen where the replay showed a broken man walking away from the body of a god, and he was quiet for a long time before he answered. It is not their strength, he said. It is not their speed or their claws. They do not have claws. It is not any weapon or any technology or any biological trick. He took a long drink and set the glass down, and his hand was shaking. It is that they remember, he said, every single name, and they never ever stop coming. The broadcast ended. The screen went dark. And somewhere in the black between the stars, a cargo shuttle carried a man with a wall of tallies scratched into his memory and a photograph over his heart, and a debt that had finally been paid. And the galaxy turned beneath him, vast and bright and full of things that would never again make the mistake of laughing at a human.